Alesia had broken the backbone of Gallic resistance. With their great leader gone and their massive coalition shattered, the uprising collapsed almost as quickly as it had formed. What had surged forward like a great wave was smashed against a smaller but unyielding force, and the confederation dissolved into fear, confusion, and resentment. Yet the war was not truly over. In different corners of Gaul, hardline leaders and desperate communities still refused to accept Roman rule. They knew they could not defeat Caesar in open battle, but some clung to the hope that if revolts flared everywhere at once, Rome's armies would be stretched too thin to crush them all. In reality, these rebellions were not part of any grand plan. They were driven by hatred of foreign domination, by despair, by the lure of plunder, and by the faint belief that once Caesar was gone, his successor might leave them alone. The first to rise again were the Bituriges, still haunted by the massacre at Avaricum. The single legion stationed among them was helpless. Caesar had hoped to give his exhausted soldiers a long rest, but before the year ended, he was back in the field. Moving with terrifying speed, he struck before the rebels had fully prepared. Thousands were captured in the fields. Others fled too late, and the suddenness of his advance sent a clear message across Gaul. Friendly tribes remained loyal, wavering ones rushed to make peace, and Caesar dismissed his legions with promises of reward before returning briefly to administrative duties. That pause did not last. New unrest soon drew him north, where the Carnutes scattered at the mere rumour of his approach. Chased through rain and cold, hunted by cavalry and light infantry, they finally broke apart and vanished among neighbouring peoples. For the moment, fear restored order, and Roman troops were left behind to enforce it. One last major threat remained. The Bellovaci, among the fiercest of the Belgic tribes, were gathering their own coalition and preparing for war. Joined by neighbouring peoples and led by determined commanders, they took up a strong defensive position in dense woodland and marshland. Caesar advanced with several legions, reinforced by German infantry to counter enemy cavalry, eager to force a decisive battle. But the Bellovaci refused to leave their ground. Skirmishes flared, foraging parties were attacked, and exaggerated rumours spread as far as Rome, claiming Caesar was trapped and defeated. The stalemate broke only when the rebels, alarmed by approaching Roman reinforcements, attempted a night withdrawal. Caesar reacted instantly, cutting across marshland, seizing the high ground and trapping them in a tense standoff. When darkness fell, the Gauls used fire as a screen and escaped into the valleys. Caesar pursued relentlessly. A final ambush planned by the rebel leader failed, and in a sharp, brutal clash the Roman forces annihilated the attackers. Their commander fought to the death, refusing surrender, and with him died the last real hope of organised resistance in the north. Elsewhere, Caesar's lieutenants finished the work. Remaining rebels were hunted down, strongholds isolated, and tribal leaders captured or driven into flight. Some tried to flee Gaul entirely, preferring exile to Roman rule, but Caesar blocked every route. In the west, new uprisings flared around key towns, but each was crushed in turn by fast-moving columns and coordinated attacks. Rebel leaders vanished into obscurity, killed, captured, or simply erased from history. The final symbol of defiance stood on a rocky hilltop fortress, supplied by water and surrounded by steep slopes. Direct assault was impossible. When Caesar arrived, he saw what his officers had missed. The defenders could endure hunger but not thirst. Roman engineers sealed off access to the river and dominated the approaches with missile fire. The besieged fought desperately, setting fires, hurling missiles, refusing to yield. Only when Roman sappers secretly diverted the spring that sustained them did resistance collapse, believing the gods themselves had turned against them the defenders surrendered. Caesar made a decision meant to end all future revolts. He spared their lives but imposed a punishment so severe it would never be forgotten. Mutilated survivors were released to carry the warning across Gaul. Resistance faded at last. With the fighting over, Caesar turned from force to policy. He knew conquest meant nothing without stability. He reduced tribute, respected local customs, rewarded loyal leaders, and avoided crushing Gallic pride. He wanted the people not merely subdued, but reconciled. When he finally left Gaul to face far greater struggles elsewhere, the land was quiet. And when he called for soldiers, the same people who had once risen against him sent their finest warriors to fight under his banner. When Caesar opened his story of the Gallic War, he sounded confident and tidy. Gaul, he said, could be split into 3 parts. One region belonged to the Belgae, another to the Aquitani, and the third to people who called themselves Celts, though Romans usually called them Gauls. He even drew neat borders between them, using major rivers as if they were natural walls. It is a famous beginning, repeated for centuries, and it feels like a map you can fold and carry. But Caesar was a commander, not a scientist. He was describing a landscape of enemies and allies, not writing a study of human origins. He had no reason to ask whether these groups were pure, or whether each one was a patchwork of older populations mixed together over time. In everyday life, people use simple names even when reality is complicated. We say English or Irish without listing every ancient layer inside those identities. Caesar did the same. His categories were useful for war and administration, not for deep analysis. A modern storyteller, though, can't ignore the messy questions Caesar brushed aside. The moment you start digging, a problem appears right at the beginning. Caesar and many other ancient writers described the Gauls as physically striking people, often tall, often fair, sometimes even with light eyes. Yet when you travel across France today, you notice something different. In some areas you do find tall, light-haired men, especially in parts of the north and northeast. But across much of the country they are not the majority. In many regions, the typical look is shorter and darker. That gap between the ancient description and the modern impression demands an explanation. One answer is simple but powerful. Ancient observers often noticed what stood out. A Roman soldier meeting an unfamiliar population would remember the most visually dramatic figures. And on a battlefield, the people most likely to stand out were warriors, men strong enough to fight, wealthy enough to arm themselves, proud enough to display their status. If that warrior class leaned taller or fairer than the general population, then Caesar's Gauls might reflect the men he faced in war more than the full society behind them. There's another possibility, even more unsettling. What if Gaul was never one look at all? What if 2 major physical types lived side by side, one tall and fair, the other shorter and darker, with many people in between? If that was the case, the tall, fair warriors could dominate attention, while the darker groups, quieter and less visible to Roman eyes, blended into the background. Over generations, intermarriage would create a spectrum, not clean categories. That would explain why ancient descriptions feel so consistent, yet modern France looks so varied. Then comes the hardest question. If tall, fair people were more noticeable in Caesar's time, why do they seem less dominant today? Several forces could push a population in that direction without any dramatic mystery. Caesar's wars were catastrophic. Huge numbers died. Huge numbers were sold away. If the fighting disproportionately removed the warrior class, and if that class contained a higher share of the tall, fair type, then the visible Gaul of Caesar's battlefield could shrink sharply in the generations that followed. After the conquest, life also changed. Crowded towns grew, diseases spread more easily, and harsh urban conditions punished some bodies more than others. Over time, even small differences in survival and family size can reshape the balance of traits across a whole country. This is where the story becomes dangerous, because it's easy to oversimplify and start treating labels like Celt as if they were biological facts. The word Celt is one of the most slippery names in European history. Sometimes it means a language family. Sometimes it means the peoples ancient writers happened to group together. Sometimes it becomes a romantic identity that later ages project backward. One author might use Celt as a loose synonym for Gaul. Another might apply it to only one section of Gaul. Another might even use it for groups far beyond Gaul. And once you realise that Celtic languages were spoken by communities with very different appearances, you're forced to separate language from race, in the old-fashioned sense. In real human history, language spreads through trade, prestige, conquest, intermarriage, and politics. It does not travel only through pure bloodlines, because those almost never exist. So if you want to understand who lived in Gaul, before and during Caesar's conquest, you have to use many kinds of evidence at once. Ancient texts matter, but they can be vague or second-hand. Place names and language clues matter, but interpretations change over time. Burials and artifacts matter, but they do not come with labels explaining who made them. Physical studies of skeletons and living populations can help, but they also have limits. Measurements can reveal patterns, but patterns are not the same thing as a complete history, and two experts can look at the same data and argue in opposite directions. There is also a bigger debate hiding underneath all this. How much of human variation comes from long inheritance, and how much from environment? Some thinkers once pushed the idea that climate and geography could reshape people quickly, almost like nature, painting them lighter or darker depending on latitude and sunlight. But when you look closely at Europe, the distribution of height, hair colour and facial features does not form a clean gradient from south to north. Instead, it forms a patchwork. Tall regions in surprising places, short regions far apart, dark enclaves living next to fair populations, mountain communities that don't match the expectations. The map is irregular because history is irregular. People move, they settle, they mix, they sometimes remain isolated, they sometimes replace others, they sometimes adopt new languages without changing their ancestry much at all. Caesar drew a clear picture of central Gaul. Between the rivers in the southwest and the great waterways of the northeast, he says, lived the people who called themselves Celts, even though Romans usually lumped them under the broader name Gauls. He also hints at where this world began and ended by listing major tribes inside it, while quietly pushing the Roman-controlled coastal belt to the side. Even the borders are not perfectly firm. Some peoples on the margins could be counted one way or another, depending on the moment, the source, and the Roman writer doing the sorting. Then comes the detail that shaped later imagination. Ancient authors repeatedly describe the Gauls as physically imposing. Over and over you hear the same language: tall bodies, light hair, sometimes even pale eyes. Poets, historians, and geographers keep returning to that image. Yet even in antiquity, there are hints that this Gallic look was not identical everywhere. Some writers suggest the Gauls were not as tall or as fair as the Germans across the Rhine. That comparison matters because it implies a spectrum, not a single uniform type. So what was Caesar really seeing? The first thing to understand is that a conquering army does not meet a whole society equally. It meets the people who fight. When Romans marched into Gaul, the faces they remembered were the men standing in formation with shields and spears, the riders charging on horseback, the leaders who came forward to negotiate. In other words, Rome's Gauls were often Gaul's warrior class. And if that class leaned taller and lighter than the wider population, the Roman description would naturally skew toward the most striking figures. But there is also a deeper possibility. Central Gaul may already have been a mosaic of different physical types. Alongside tall, fair warriors, there could have been large numbers of shorter, darker communities whose daily life took place away from the Roman spotlight. Over time, those groups would mix, producing every shade between the extremes. That would explain why ancient descriptions feel confident and repetitive, while the reality on the ground could still be complex. Now add the next layer. What happened after Caesar? For centuries, waves of newcomers moved into different parts of what became France. Some settled as rulers, some as soldiers, some as migrants, some as small colonies. The region saw Germanic-speaking groups in the north and east, new populations along key rivers, seaborne settlers on the coasts, and people arriving in cities from across the Mediterranean world. None of this means the older population vanished. It means the genetic and cultural mix kept changing, unevenly, from one district to another. That unevenness is important. Even in the modern era, if you step back and look at France broadly, you can still sense patterns. Lighter traits more common in parts of the north and northeast, darker traits more common in many southern areas. But the pattern is never clean. You find fair districts in places you would not expect, and darker enclaves in places that seem to break the rule. You also find the same contradiction again and again. Communities that are relatively tall yet dark, or relatively fair yet short, or populations that show a strong round-headed tendency while still having a noticeable fair element. The country is full of overlaps, and this is where the story becomes a cautionary tale about labels. Some researchers try to draw a sharp line between the peoples Caesar called Celts and those he called Belgae, arguing that one group was mostly short and dark, and the other tall and fair. The temptation is obvious. You want a simple map that matches a simple theory, but the real evidence refuses to behave. Ancient writers sometimes describe the broader population as sharing a common Gaulish look, even while admitting differences in speech and local identity. Caesar himself uses general language that suggests he's not separating the physical type of one northern region from the other central region as strictly as later theories tried to do. At the same time, archaeology and the human remains found in certain areas show that tall, long-skulled warriors did exist in the wider Gallic world, especially in zones where wealthy burials are concentrated. But those remains are limited, scattered, and unevenly preserved. They prove presence, not proportions. And they do not erase the fact that many parts of central Gaul clearly contain substantial numbers of shorter, darker, round-headed communities as well. So the real question becomes sharper. If ancient sources keep highlighting a tall, fair Gallic type, why does that type seem far less dominant in many parts of central France today? One extreme explanation is that the tall, fair Gauls were always few, just a narrow elite. But that collapses under scrutiny. Armies were not made only of aristocrats. Large forces fought year after year. Even if leadership circles were small, the warrior population as a whole could not have been a tiny caste detached from everyone else. And besides, multiple ancient authors describe the Gauls in general terms, not as a rare curiosity. A more realistic answer is simpler, and it doesn't require any fantasy. The tall, fair element may have been visible and influential without ever being the majority. It may have stood out because it was concentrated among fighters and leaders. It also suffered heavily in the years of conquest. Battle deaths, massacres, enslavement, and displacement. If those losses hit the warrior class hardest, they would hit the most noticed type hardest. Then, over the next 2,000 years, mixing continued relentlessly. In mixed populations, traits don't freeze in place. They shift with marriage patterns, survival, disease, urban growth, and plain demographic momentum. And if the darker types were already more numerous at the start, the long-term drift could naturally move in their direction, even while fair traits remained scattered across the map. There's one last detail that helps the documentary land emotionally. Roman writers compared Gauls to Germans and implied Germans were more of what the Romans noticed: taller, fairer, more extreme in the same direction. That suggests that even Caesar's dramatic first impressions had a baseline. Gaul may have been a land where the classic Gallic look existed and mattered, but it was not uniform, not pure, and not isolated from older layers beneath it. When we look at old studies that try to map types across France and Belgium, there is an easy trap to fall into. The charts and tables make it look as if each region is filled with one uniform kind of person, as if an entire department could be labelled short and dark or tall and fair, and the story would be finished. But any careful traveller would realise almost immediately that real life does not work like that. Those tables were meant to describe broad tendencies, not a clean rule, and many of them were built on limited samples. If you actually walk the roads, visit markets, watch people working in the fields, and listen to local stories, you see variety everywhere. That is why earlier observers kept insisting that the classic, tall, long-faced Gallic look had not vanished at all. They reported meeting men with strong chins, prominent noses, long skulls, and striking height in places where the statistics might make you expect the opposite. Even in central regions that are often described as dominated by shorter, darker groups, you still find individuals who look like they belong to that older, warrior-shaped profile. The type may not be everywhere, but it is not a myth either. And we also have to remember Switzerland. Caesar counts the Helvetii among the peoples of central Gaul, and there is strong reason to think that the Helvetii, in particular, carried a powerful warrior Gaul presence. Earlier populations in the region were mixed, like most of Gaul, but the archaeological story suggests periods when taller newcomers rose to dominance. By the time we reach the later Iron Age, the Helvetii appear not as a minor footnote, but as a strong Celtic-speaking group, capable of expansion and control. In other words, even within Celtic Gaul, there were places where the tall, forceful Gallic element seems especially visible. So the real question is not whether tall, fair Gauls existed among the Celtae. Everyone agrees that they did, at least to some degree. The harder question is whether those men were essentially the same people as the tall, fair element among the Belgi, and whether we are dealing with one broad incoming population or two distinct waves. Language is often presented as the key that might unlock this. But the linguistic evidence is frustratingly thin. Almost nothing survives beyond names of people, tribes, rivers, and a small number of inscriptions. Still, scholars noticed an important split inside the Celtic world. One branch turns an older KW sound into a P sound, while another branch keeps it closer to KW, and later shifts it in a different direction. This created the famous contrast between two Celtic families. The problem is that the surviving scraps from Gaul can be read in more than one way. Some researchers see hints that an older, different Celtic-like speech once existed in pockets of Gaul, while others argue those hints point to a non-Celtic local language that was later pushed aside by mainstream Gaulish. And even if a different speech did exist earlier, a carved stone does not automatically prove what the majority around it spoke. A traveller, a soldier, or a small migrant group can leave an inscription far from home. When you step back from the scholarly duels, one large point remains surprisingly solid. In Caesar's time, the dominant Celtic language of Gaul was shared widely, including among the Belgae. That strongly suggests the conquering elites in both regions belong to the same broad cultural world, or at least to closely related groups. Differences may have existed, but the core language landscape does not support the idea of two completely separate peoples standing on opposite sides of a sharp ethnic wall. This matters because the ancient authors describe the Belgae in almost the same physical terms as other Gauls. They are portrayed as tall and often fair, and not dramatically different in outward appearance. Yet Caesar also reports something explosive. His informant said many Belgae were originally linked to Germans, and a handful of tribes were even labelled German in his day. Later, writers struggled to interpret that claim, and modern scholars have too. It could reflect real migration across the Rhine, or it could be a political label, or a way of stressing toughness and frontier identity rather than pure ancestry. What is clear is that the Belgic region did receive heavy Germanic settlement after Caesar's era, and that fact alone reshapes the modern picture. By late antiquity and the early medieval period, the northern zone saw repeated Germanic movement and long-term settlement. Over time, this would naturally increase the number of tall, fair individuals, and also shift the regional averages in noticeable ways. So when modern measurements show Belgic areas tending to be taller and lighter than much of central France, we cannot simply assume we are looking at a frozen snapshot of Caesar's world. We are seeing 2,000 years of change layered on top of earlier foundations. At the same time, the north was never purely one thing. Even in Belgic territory, round-headed and darker elements are clearly present. That raises an awkward issue. If Belgic groups truly pushed out earlier populations, why do we still see so much of the older look in the region? One answer is the simplest. The older look was never fully expelled. Another is that the Belgae themselves already included significant diversity. The conquest stories may describe power shifts more than total population replacement. A ruling group can take land without erasing everyone who was already there, and over generations the groups blend until borders become memories, not realities. This is where the debate over the Walloons becomes a dramatic case study. Some researchers argue that the Walloons, especially in certain valleys and upland zones, preserve an older Belgic core. They point out that, in places, you see tall frames and sharp, long facial lines that do not look typically Germanic. Yet the same observers stress that many of these tall Walloons are darker haired than expected if we imagine the classic Gaul as overwhelmingly blonde. That led to a provocative model. Perhaps a fair-haired elite it once existed, while the wider mass was tall but darker, with older local ancestry mixed in. Others pushed back, arguing that darker colouring could easily be the result of deep mixing with prehistoric dark populations, and that the purest communities might even show more fairness than their neighbours. The honest conclusion is that we cannot settle this with certainty. The evidence is too tangled, and the past 2 millennia have remixed the deck too many times. What we can say is that Belgic Gaul, then and now, was likely a borderland in every sense, a zone where tall, warlike, Celtic-speaking groups, older local populations, and later Germanic settlers overlapped and blended. The ancient writers probably were not lying when they described the Belgae as generally fairer than many southern peoples. But it is hard to accept that fairness was confined to a tiny circle of chiefs. More likely, the Belgic region contained a stronger share of the northern, tall, lighter element than central Gaul did. even while darker traits remained widespread. When we speak about the tall, fair conquerors of Gaul, we are not suggesting that every Gaul looked the same. No large human population has ever been a single, uniform physical type. Variety has always existed, shaped by geography, movement, and centuries of mixing. Even the people's ancient writers described with the greatest confidence would have shown local differences and individual variation. What we mean is something simpler and more practical. Among the warrior elites and the migrating groups who carried Celtic power across Gaul, certain traits stood out strongly to outsiders. Height and lighter colouring were the features that drew attention first, and over time, those features became part of the image, others remembered and repeated. For a long time, there was a major gap in the evidence. Ancient authors enjoyed describing appearances, but they rarely provided the kinds of details modern researchers would want. Early physical studies struggled as well, because only a small number of burials were available. But as archaeology expanded and more Iron Age graves were carefully examined, a clearer pattern began to emerge. Many of the Celtic-speaking groups who entered Gaul during this period showed a long-headed skull form. The same general shape appears again centuries later in early medieval warrior burials. This does not mean that every Celtic community was built the same way from top to bottom. Graves tend to preserve the wealthy, the armed, and the socially prominent, while the everyday majority often remains harder to see. Even so, the repetition of this pattern across time and space is difficult to dismiss. This leads us directly into one of the most debated questions in the field. Were the Gauls and the Germans essentially the same people? More scholars than one might expect have argued some version of this idea. The reason is easy to understand. Greek and Roman writers describe both groups using almost the same language. They emphasize tall stature, fair colouring, and an intimidating physical presence. Some accounts suggest that Germans were even taller or lighter, but those impressions alone do not prove a sharp ethnic divide. By the 1st century of our era, Gaul was already heavily mixed, and that alone could explain why certain individuals looked more German than Gallic to Roman eyes. Archaeology reinforces the sense of resemblance. In Central Europe, classic Germanic warrior burials repeatedly show long-headed skulls, and the same general form appears among remains linked to later groups, such as the Franks, Goths, and Saxons. When we place these finds beside Iron Age warrior burials associated with Celtic expansion, it becomes clear why earlier researchers saw the two as closely related or even nearly identical. Judged only by height, lighter colouring, and skull shape, the overlap is real. But resemblance does not mean sameness. The more interesting question is whether these groups shared the same kind of fairness. In other words, did they tend toward the same shades and the same facial appearance? Ancient writers rarely bothered with such subtle distinctions, so researchers searched for another way to approach the problem. Attention turned toward Celtic-speaking communities in the British Isles, especially in regions where older settlement patterns remained visible for long periods. This approach has its limits because these populations were also mixtures. Still, a recurring observation emerged. In areas tied to Celtic language and identity, a long-faced, sharp-featured look appears again and again. The same impression shows up in Brittany, settled by Britons, in parts of northern France, and even in regions of northern Italy, once shaped by Celtic power. Many observers have felt that this so-called Celtic look does not fully match the most classic Northern German or Scandinavian type. Hair colour highlights the contrast even more clearly. Across many Celtic-speaking regions, red hair appears with striking frequency. This does not only mean vivid red, but also warmer undertones running through browns and darker shades. In contrast, populations usually described as more purely northern Germanic tend to show a higher concentration of pale blonde and flaxen tones, with less of that red cast. This is not a rigid rule, and it certainly does not mean that Celts were red-haired and Germans blonde. What it suggests is a difference in emphasis, a difference in what was common enough to be noticed. If there was a split, it may have looked something like this. Both groups descended from an older, northern fair population, long before the Roman period. But by the time history sees them clearly, their appearance had begun to drift apart in small but recognizable ways. Language brings this distinction into even sharper focus. Some writers have argued that the tall, fair conquerors did not originally speak Celtic, and that they adopted it from the people they ruled. But this idea breaks down when we look at the broader pattern of Celtic expansion. Across Gaul, across Britain, into Iberia, and even into Asia Minor, the same pattern appears. Wherever these warbands settled, we find Celtic names, Celtic rulers, and Celtic place names. It is difficult to believe that conquering elites repeatedly adopted the identity and naming system of the populations they dominated, especially across such a vast area. While language shifts do happen, they usually require specific conditions. In many ancient conquests, a small but organized elite spreads its speech, especially when it settles permanently with families, rather than ruling from a distance. The simplest explanation remains the strongest. The Celtic-speaking conquerors entered these lands already speaking Celtic, and their language spread alongside their power. This matters because Celtic languages are closer to Latin than to Germanic languages. Even if Gauls and Germans once belonged to a shared ancestral world, far in the past they had already separated into distinct cultural and linguistic branches long before Caesar's time. That makes it entirely believable that by then they were not just two names for the same people, but related groups that had grown apart. This brings us back to Caesar's famous claim that the Belgi were of German origin. Even at face value, the statement is slippery. Caesar reports it as something he was told, and elsewhere he treats only certain border groups as truly German, while the wider Belgic population speaks Celtic and carries Celtic names. Later, writers add further confusion. Some tribes appear to have wanted to be seen as German, which may suggest that German functioned as a label for toughness and frontier identity rather than a strict linguistic category. The safest reading is that German origin may simply have meant ancestry, east of the Rhine, not necessarily speakers of a Germanic language in the later, narrower sense. When everything is brought together, the picture that emerges is complex but coherent. Gaul did not begin with a single people. Deep prehistory left multiple layers behind. Later waves arrived from the east, including both round-headed and long-headed groups. During the Iron Age, Celtic-speaking newcomers expanded and rose to dominance. Over time, they mixed with older populations, and by Caesar's day, the peoples of central Gaul were already blended. Many were shorter and darker, many were round-headed, and yet a visible share still carried the tall, fair, long-headed look that ancient writers associated with Gauls, in the classic sense. In the north, among the Belgae, that tall element may have been stronger, and later centuries added fresh Germanic settlement that pushed the balance even further. What we are left with is not a clean ethnic diagram, but a long process of movement, conquest, marriage, and gradual blending. And this raises the final question. Why does any of this matter? Why spend so much effort debating skull shape, hair colour, or ancient labels? Because the real goal is not classification. The real goal is understanding how these layers shaped societies. Why cultures merged quickly in some regions and resisted in others. why languages spread rapidly in one place but survived against pressure elsewhere, why certain political systems formed, and why Roman rule reshaped Gaul so deeply. Identity in the ancient world was not inherited from a single source. It was built slowly and unevenly from mixed origins. The story of a few Belgic border tribes is far messier than the clean labels we like to use. Take names like the Eburones, Kairosi, Paimani, Segni, and Condrusi. In Caesar's narrative, they sit on the frontier where Gaul and the world beyond the Rhine seem to blur into each other. Some informants call them Germans. In other places, they appear inside the Belgic coalition like any other Belgic people. Later, scholars looked at the same evidence and argued in the opposite direction, insisting they were simply Celts. That debate matters because it shows how slippery ancient ethnic words can be, and how quickly modern readers can treat them as fixed categories. One argument says, look at the names. The personal names, the tribal names, the river names, the place names in their homeland. So many of them look Celtic. If the labels on the map are Celtic, the people must have been Celtic too. But that reasoning has a weakness. Names can outlive identities. A region can keep older place names even after newcomers arrive. A mixed society can use the language of the majority for naming, while still carrying different ancestry in parts of its population. Even in other parts of Europe, we can find territories with Celtic place names long after Celtic power faded. So the naming evidence is important, but it does not settle the question on its own. Then there is Caesar himself. He does not just report that outsiders called these groups Germans. At least in his telling, some of these communities describe themselves that way when they send envoys to him. They speak as if they belong to a wider set of Germans on this side of the Rhine, and they ask Caesar not to treat them as enemies simply because other groups in that category are hostile. That makes it harder to dismiss the label as a casual insult or a misunderstanding. Caesar also claims he understands clear differences between Gauls and Germans in customs, religion, and language, and he had interpreters and contacts who knew people across the Rhine. So he cannot just wave the whole thing away as if nobody involved knew what they were talking about. But here is the key point. Even if Caesar uses the word German, we still have to ask what his sources meant by it. The label might not have meant German-speaking in the later, stricter sense. It might have meant people with roots east of the Rhine, or frontier folk with older ways, or newer arrivals compared to their neighbours. In that case, a tribe could be called German while speaking Celtic and sharing much of Belgic culture. Over time, any genuinely German-speaking families could have been absorbed into a larger Celtic-speaking environment, leaving behind a society that was German in origin stories or reputation, but Celtic in daily life. The most realistic picture is a borderland blend, some Eastern ancestry, heavy cultural Celticization, and a name that carried political meaning as much as biological truth. The second half of this passage shifts to a different kind of problem. How many people lived in Gaul in Caesar's day? And here the documentary tone should slow down, because the numbers tempt us into false certainty. Caesar gives figures for the Helvetii migrating, and he reports estimates of how many fighters different Belgic tribes could field. Later, writers give even larger totals for the numbers Caesar supposedly faced in war. Modern historians have tried to turn those fragments into a total population count, but every method rests on assumptions we cannot truly verify. How dense different regions were, how complete a mobilization really was, how accurate intelligence from local informants could be, and how much ancient authors exaggerate either from confusion or from storytelling. This is why estimates swing wildly. One approach produces a few million. Another suggests 6 million. Another stretches into the double digits. If you assume one tribe's maximum levy represents a fixed fraction of its total population, then scale that across all Gaul, you can generate huge totals very quickly. But that scaling is exactly where the math becomes dangerous. Gaul was not uniformly fertile. It did not have the same settlement density everywhere. Vast areas were still forest, marsh, or rough ground compared with later centuries. Even if some districts were thickly peopled, others were not. Multiply one rich region by the whole map, and you will almost certainly inflate the final number. And there is an even deeper problem. Wartime counting is famously unreliable. Commanders, scouts, refugees, and allied informants routinely get enemy numbers wrong, sometimes honestly and sometimes for political reasons. Later, historians can copy those wrong numbers and repeat them with confidence. To make that point feel real for a modern audience, you can use a simple comparison. Even in much more recent times, officials have repeated population figures that later censuses proved wildly exaggerated. If modern administrators could be that far off with better tools, how much faith should we place in ancient estimates formed in the chaos of war? So the honest conclusion is not a neat number. It is a range, and even that range has soft edges. Gaul was clearly populous by ancient standards, capable of raising very large armies and sustaining many tribal territories. But any attempt to give a precise total will always be a construction built on guesswork. The responsible approach is to show the audience how the estimates are made, why they differ, and why the most confident-looking figures may be the least trustworthy. When we read Caesar's account of Gaul, it is tempting to assume that every geographical detail he gives must be perfectly precise. But that assumption quickly runs into problems. Even in cases where Caesar clearly knew the reality on the ground, his descriptions sometimes simplify or generalize the landscape. Later, scholars noticed this long ago. For example, Caesar must have known that the Bituriges Vivisti lived on both sides of the Garonne. Yet he still describes the river as the boundary between Aquitania and Celtic Gaul. That tells us something important. He wasn't always trying to draw borders with modern precision. He was describing regions in a practical, functional way. The same issue appears elsewhere. Some Belgic peoples occupied land on what Caesar describes as the wrong side of certain rivers. The Seine and the Marne are said to divide the Belgae from the Celtae, yet parts of Belgic territory lay south of those rivers. These are not errors born of ignorance. They are reminders that Caesar was writing for a Roman audience using broad geographic ideas rather than exact cartography. The danger comes when later readers treat every sentence as if it were a modern survey. When we read Caesar with a measure of common sense, his account is more than accurate enough for understanding events on the ground. This becomes especially important when we try to define the territories of Gallic tribes. One of the biggest questions is how Caesar understood client peoples. Did he treat them as mere subdivisions of larger tribes, or as distinct communities, with their own lands? Some earlier scholars assumed that client tribes were little more than districts within a dominant state. But when we read Caesar carefully, that view does not hold up. He never calls client peoples simple districts. Instead, he consistently refers to them as independent communities, even when they were politically dependent on stronger neighbours. In practice, Caesar usually distinguishes the land of a client tribe from the land of its overlord. When migrating groups crossed into certain regions, he carefully notes that they entered the territories of client peoples, not the core land of the dominant tribe. At the same time, There are moments when Caesar clearly includes the land of a client, people within the territory of their patron. This tells us that political reality in Gaul was flexible. Sometimes a client's land was treated as separate. Sometimes it was counted as part of a larger whole. Context mattered. This complexity makes mapping Gaul extraordinarily difficult. Any attempt to produce a single, perfectly accurate map runs into serious limitations. The ancient landscape included countless small rivers, ridges, and settlements that are not visible on most modern maps. Detailed military maps exist, but they were never meant to resolve historical debates. Even the best modern reconstructions can only illustrate the story, not prove every argument behind it. Some maps look impressive because they trace every march and movement described in the Gallic War. But visual completeness does not equal accuracy. When a map confidently places camps, battlefields, and routes whose locations cannot actually be proven, it becomes misleading. A more cautious map may look less satisfying, but it is closer to the truth. In historical geography, admitting uncertainty is not a weakness. It is honesty. The same problem appears when we try to draw the borders of Gallic states. In most cases, we can only estimate their general position and approximate size. Only rarely can a section of a frontier be traced with real precision. Some later scholars believed it was possible to reconstruct the entire map of Gaul by using later church boundaries. In certain cases, these boundaries do seem to preserve older divisions, but it would be reckless to assume that this method works everywhere. The transition from independent Gallic societies to Roman administration reshaped the map in subtle but important ways. Some tribes were destroyed. Others were reduced by war and absorbed into neighbouring communities. New administrative units were created to balance territory and population. Large states were broken apart. Smaller ones were merged. Over time, the Roman system produced a map that only partly reflected what had existed before. Client relationships further complicate the picture. In many cases, it is impossible to say how much land belonged to a dominant tribe and how much belonged to its dependents. Caesar does not always mention every people we later know existed. Some groups appear in later records but are absent from his narrative altogether. Were they clients? Were they small districts? Or were they simply not relevant to the events he described? We often cannot say. Despite all this, ancient dioceses remain valuable evidence. In many cases, they probably do reflect older territorial realities, at least roughly. The mistake is not in using them at all, but in relying on them too rigidly. They are guides, not final answers. Where they fail, we must simply acknowledge the limits of what we can know. Another factor often overlooked is that tribal boundaries in Gaul were not fixed lines on a map. They shifted over time. Territory could be gained or lost through conflict. Control of river valleys mattered enormously, because rivers meant trade and tolls. A tribe's land was not defined by ancient treaties, carved in stone, but by its ability to assert control at a given moment. Caesar described the situation as he found it, not as it had always been. Even the coastline cannot be taken for granted. The shape of the shore in Caesar's time was not the same as it is today. The sea advanced in some places and retreated in others. Scholars have tried to reconstruct the ancient coastline, but even these efforts involve a degree of guesswork. Still, such reconstructions are usually closer to reality than simply copying a modern map. For the study of Caesar's campaigns, these coastal changes matter only in a few specific cases. For the most part, they are of greater interest to physical geographers than to military historians. What matters more is recognizing that every map of ancient Gaul is, to some extent, a compromise between evidence and uncertainty. The same cautious approach applies to ancient road systems and distance measurements. Roman itineraries and maps were compiled over centuries. They mix information from different periods. Distances are sometimes given in Roman miles, sometimes in local units. The systems are generally consistent enough to be useful, but they were never intended as precision instruments. For our purposes, they help confirm routes and relative positions, not exact measurements, down to the last meter. In the end, the lesson is simple. Ancient geography cannot be forced into modern expectations of accuracy. Caesar was not writing a textbook of cartography. He was describing a living, shifting world shaped by politics, war, and movement. When we read his account with flexibility and restraint, it remains one of the most reliable guides we possess. When we demand from it a level of precision it was never meant to provide, we only mislead ourselves. When we try to map Caesar's Gaul, we immediately run into a problem that sounds simple, but never is. Tribal borders were not clean lines on a modern atlas. They shifted, overlapped, and sometimes depended on who was strong enough to control a road, a valley, or a river crossing at that moment. Even so, we can still sketch the big shapes, and one of the best examples is the Aedui. If we treat the Aedui as most modern reconstructions do, meaning we include not only their core lands, but also the territories tied to them through dependency and alliance, their sphere covers a wide belt of Central Eastern Gaul. In modern terms, it roughly overlaps the regions around Autun, Chalon, Mâcon, and Nevers, with extensions into neighbouring areas. Over time, later, Roman administrative patterns seem to confirm that this Aeduan world was not small. In later centuries, it likely expanded further, swallowing or absorbing districts that may not have been fully Aeduan in Caesar's day. The point is not to pretend we can draw every border with confidence. The point is to understand that the Aedui were a heavyweight power, with a territory that made them one of the main keys to Gaul. That brings us to a deceptively sharp line in Caesar's narrative. He says the Loire divided the Aedui from the Bituriges. Some readers treat that as a perfect geographic rule. Others argue it is only a rough description. So we ask the practical question: what does Caesar actually describe happening? He tells us an Aeduan force reached the Loire, paused for several days, and then turned back because they did not dare cross. That detail matters. It suggests they believed that crossing the river would put them onto hostile ground, meaning the far bank was understood as Biturigan territory, at least in that stretch of the river. Now here is where the map fights back. Later boundary patterns show a small strip of land that complicates this tidy picture, because there are hints that Aeduan-controlled administration reached across part of the river. That creates two possibilities. Either the Aeduan force reached the Loire at a point where the river really did act as the frontier, farther along the valley, or the Aedui simply did not control that strip on the far side in Caesar's time. In other words, Caesar's line about the Loire makes sense if we stop treating rivers like permanent borders and start treating them as lines that could be true in one sector and false in another. The eastern edge of Aeduan territory is even trickier. Some ancient writers speak as if the Saon separated the Aedui from the Sequani. The others imply something less exact. Caesar himself describes the Saon flowing through the lands of both peoples, which does not automatically mean it was a border. One reading is that he is simply describing a river running through a broad combined region. Another reading is that he is hinting at a frontier. The most honest conclusion is that the evidence refuses to give us certainty. The Saon may have been a rough divider, but control of river tolls was a constant source of conflict, and that alone tells us this was a zone of disputed authority. Whoever held both banks could enforce payments. Whoever lacked one bank had a problem. So rather than a neat border, we may be looking at contested ground that shifted with power. Once we accept that reality, the next step becomes clear. We can still use later administrative patterns as clues, but we cannot treat them like absolute proof. Roman reorganization, war losses, tribal destruction, forced mergers, and later divisions all reshaped the map. Some communities disappear. Others appear later with new names. Some territories are split to balance size. Some are fused because they are too weak to stand alone. So whenever we claim certainty, we have to check whether we are describing Caesar's world or a later Roman one projected backward. From territory, we move to a concrete test case, Agadincum. For generations, most scholars identified it with Sens. A minority argued for Provence, but that idea collapses once we track the movement described in the campaign. The critical clue is the river crossing. Labienus withdraws from one bank of the Seine to the other as he turns back toward Agadincum, and Caesar's wording makes it clear that Labienus was squeezed between enemy forces on opposite sides. That only works if Agadincum lies where Sens lies, not at Provence. The geography of the situation forces the answer. Then we stack the confirmations. Caesar says Agadincum was in the territory of the Senones. In the early Christian period, the leading town of the Senones is Sens. Ancient geographic tradition also points to the same place. Later route lists give distances that align well with Sens when compared against real travel lengths. And there is even later epigraphic evidence from Sens itself that preserves the name in a recognizable form. When multiple independent trails converge like this, the simplest conclusion becomes the strongest. Agadincum is Sens. Some have tried to escape that conclusion by arguing that a Roman town later rose at Sens and inherited the name, while Caesar's Agadincum was somewhere else. But that idea has a fatal weakness. If a brand new Roman foundation replaced an older Gallic centre, it usually did not keep a purely Celtic name. Roman power loved stamping its presence into city names. If the main town had been moved and rebuilt as a Roman creation, we would expect a name shaped by Roman authority, not a simple continuation of the old one. So the two Agadincums idea solves nothing and creates more problems than it removes. And now we reach the magnet of the entire debate. Alautia. On one level, the story sounds settled. The strongest case places Alautia on the plateau, now known as Mont Ossois, where Alice Sainte-Reine stands today. But the siege of Alautia became so famous that it attracted a whole industry of alternate theories. For years, writers proposed site after site, sometimes driven by local pride, sometimes by stubbornness, sometimes by a love of being the lone dissenter. If we strip away the noise, the real historical contest narrowed to two serious candidates, Mont Ossois and Alais. To judge them, we have to follow Caesar's sequence, not modern preference. Caesar describes a battle, a retreat, and then the Romans arriving at Alesia the day after the fight. He also places himself marching through the outer reaches of Lingones territory toward the land of the Sequani. That one detail anchors the whole geography. It tells us that on the night before the decisive battle, Caesar was still within Lingones country. The battle then happens nearby. After that, the defeated army falls back to Alesia, and the Romans reach it quickly. Once we accept that chain of movement, the menu of possible sites becomes very small. South of the Saône, Alais is the only candidate that even tries to fit. North of the Saône, Mont Auxois stands as the only plausible contender. So we are not choosing among endless options. We are choosing between two. Then we test our Alais against Caesar's description of the siege site. This is where it breaks. Alais is not a clean hill with the kind of surrounding terrain Caesar describes. It is a complex mountainous mass, broken by woods, ravines, and uneven ridges. The broad plain that should exist near the site, large enough for the cavalry action Caesar describes, does not exist in the required form. The surrounding heights do not match the ring implied by the narrative. Natural cliffs would have made parts of Caesar's massive engineering unnecessary. Yet he describes a system built as if nature did not already do the job. Even worse, the minimum length of an encircling line around Alais would be far larger than Caesar's stated scale. That is not a small mismatch. It is a structural collapse. And the logic of the campaign breaks too. If Alaisa were Alesia, we would have to believe Vercingetorix prepared the fortress with supplies long before Caesar's move, as if he had advanced knowledge not only of Caesar's intentions but also of the exact route he would choose. That level of foreknowledge is not realistic. A central position like Mont Auxois makes strategic sense because it lets Vercingetorix threaten multiple routes. Alais does not. It would also leave key regions exposed, giving Caesar freedom to strike at places a Gallic commander could not afford to abandon. On the Alais theory, the campaign becomes a string of unlikely choices by a commander who is anything but careless. The final blow is practical movement. The Alaise model forces us to accept a ridiculous pace across difficult country while crossing multiple rivers in a tiny window of time, with Caesar strangely failing to mention most of those crossings. It also requires Vercingetorix to ignore obvious moments to attack, such as a major river crossing under threat. That would mean the strongest Gallic commander in the war simply watched, and did nothing during one of the most vulnerable phases of Roman movement. That is not how the war reads, and it is not how competent command works. Once Alais collapses, the remaining candidate is Mont Auxois. And here, the evidence stops being merely plausible and starts becoming concrete. The site fits Caesar's physical description far better. The surrounding landscape makes sense for the positions of camps and attacks described in the final phase. And excavation matters. Archaeology has revealed traces consistent with a major Gallic settlement, and later Roman occupation. Finds connected to siege works have been identified on and around the plateau. Weapons and remains consistent with violent conflict have been recovered. Large numbers of coins appear, including many tied to the peoples who took part in the relief effort, and a striking concentration from the homeland of Vercingetorix. The pattern is exactly what we would expect if this is where the final struggle happened. At that point, the argument becomes less about romance and more about probability. To deny Mont Auxois, we would need to believe that a different site, somewhere else, somehow matched Caesar's description closely enough to fool generations, and then also produced the kind of archaeological footprint we would expect from the most famous siege in the Gallic War, and yet left no reliable record of that separate event. The odds of that coincidence are vanishingly small. When we look at the peoples of southeastern Gaul, the Allobroges stand out as a key bridge between worlds. Caesar tells us enough to outline their land, but not enough to draw sharp borders. What we can say with confidence is this: the Rhone formed a major line in their geography, separating them from the Helvetii to the east, while parts of their territory stretched onto the river's right bank. Their neighbours included the Voconti, the Segusiavi, and the Nantuates, and their northernmost stronghold was Geneva. Their major urban centres were Vienna and Cularo, places that later became Vienne and Grenoble. Put together, this places the heart of Allobrogian territory, between the Rhone, the Isère, and Lake Geneva. In broad terms, their land overlaps what later Roman administration would organise around Vienne, Grenoble, and Geneva. But we need to be careful. Later, church boundaries and Roman divisions absorbed smaller groups into larger units, and the logic behind those mergers is often lost to us. Some mountain peoples were folded into dioceses that do not truly reflect their earlier independence. That means we cannot simply copy later maps and assume they reflect Iron Age reality. Even so, we can still sketch the Allobroges' reach. To the east, their land seems to have extended as far as the shores near modern Evian, possibly slightly beyond. Beyond that lay the Nantuates and the Veragri, who controlled key alpine valleys and towns like Saint-Maurice and Martigny. To the south, the Souterrains occupied the Tarentaise Valley, and inscriptions from the Roman period allow us to trace a frontier line that likely followed older boundaries. That line ran through mountain valleys, ridges, and river junctions, showing how geography shaped political limits, long before Rome formalized them. Further south and southeast, other small peoples filled the alpine valleys. The Meduli held the Maurienne. The Uceni and Tricori occupied the valleys of the Romanche and the Drac. Whether rivers like the Isère always marked firm borders is unclear. Sometimes rivers did serve as frontiers. Sometimes they were simply shared arteries, fought over for tolls and control. The truth probably changed from place to place and from decade to decade. One issue that has long puzzled historians is the Allobroges land west of the Rhône. Caesar clearly mentions Allobrogian possessions on that side of the river, and he also tells us those lands were devastated during the Helvetian migration. That matters. The Helvetii were marching toward Aegean territory, not southward, which means the Allobrogian lands they ravaged must have lain along their route, not far off it. This pushes those western Allobrogian holdings closer to the region between the Rhône and the Saône, rather than deep into southern Gaul. When we shift northward, we encounter the Ambari. Their name still echoes in modern place names like Amberieux. Their land lay between the Rhône and the Saône, filling much of what is now the department of Ain. If we map out the territories of their neighbours first, Aedui, Sequani, Helvetii, Allobroges and Segusiavi, what remains fits the Ambari remarkably well. Their northern boundary is harder to pin down. Some scholars push it toward Marcon, others stop it further south. The evidence is thin, and certainty is impossible. What seems likely is that the Ambari originally occupied land on both sides of the Saône. Their very name suggests people who lived along both banks of a river. Over time, as power shifted, parts of their territory were absorbed by stronger neighbours. By Caesar's day, the picture was already blurred. Moving west, we find the Ambiani, whose territory aligns closely with the later diocese of Amiens and the modern Somme region. Their position is one of the clearer cases, which is rare in Gallic geography. More elusive are the Ambibari and the Ambiliati. These groups appear only briefly in the sources and then vanish. They are listed among the coastal peoples of Armorica, but their exact position is impossible to fix. We can say they lived somewhere along the Atlantic fringe of northwestern Gaul, likely near other maritime tribes. But beyond that, the evidence refuses to cooperate. Attempts to force them into specific dioceses or modern departments only create false certainty. Sometimes the honest answer is that we simply do not know. The same problem appears with the Ambiveretti. Caesar mentions them only once, placing them beyond the Meuse from the German perspective. That alone tells us they lived on the left bank of the river. Beyond that, everything collapses into speculation. Some place them near Antwerp, others near the Ardennes, others somewhere between the Meuse and the Rhine. None of these guesses can be proved. The safest conclusion is that they were a small dependent group, overshadowed by larger neighbours, and later erased from the record. Further south, The Andes occupied the region around Angers, covering most of what is now Maine-et-Loire. Their territory is relatively secure in outline, though even here the edges blur where neighbouring peoples pressed in. When Caesar speaks of Armorica, we need to understand what he means. He does not use the term loosely. In his writing, Armorica refers specifically to the peoples along the Atlantic coast, between the Seine and the Loire. He names them when listing those who sent forces to relieve Alesia. Notably absent are the coastal peoples east of the Seine and south of the Loire. That tells us Armorica for Caesar was not simply a word for coast, but a defined cultural and political zone. South of this zone, the Arverni dominated central Gaul. Their core territory matches the later region around Clermont and the volcanic uplands of the Massif Central. Their clients, like the Gabali, filled surrounding areas. Together, they formed one of the most powerful political blocs in Gaul, capable of producing leaders like Vercingetorix. To the north, the Atrebates occupied the land around modern Arras, while further east, we reach one of the most debated locations in all of the Gallic War, Atuatuca. Caesar places Atuatuca in the land of the Eburones and describes it as naturally strong. He implies it lay close to the Rhine, close enough that German reinforcements could reach it quickly. He also suggests it was nearer to Cicero's camp than to that of Labienus. For generations, most scholars identified Atuatuca with Tongres, a later Roman town known as Atuaca. The name fits, the road network fits, but the terrain does not. Tongres lies west of the Meuse, on ground that is not especially defensible. It lacks the steep, natural barriers Caesar describes. It is also too far from the Rhine to match the narrative comfortably. Attempts to reinterpret Caesar's words to force Tongres into the story create more problems than they solve. That does not mean we know where Atuatuca was. It means we must accept uncertainty. Several sites east of the Meuse have been proposed, including high plateaus near Liège, that better match Caesar's description of cliffs, valleys, woods, and approaches. Some of these locations fit the story remarkably well, but none can be proven beyond doubt. And that brings us to the real lesson. The map of Gaul was not fixed. Borders shifted, peoples merged, vanished, and re-emerged under new names. Caesar captured a moment in time, not an eternal truth. When we try to force his words into modern precision, we risk losing what matters most. The movement of armies, the logic of strategy, and the lived reality of a world where identity was fluid and power was contested, valley by valley. When we step back and look at all these arguments together, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. None of the proposed locations truly settles the problem. Over and over again, scholars have tried to pin Caesar's Atuatuca to a single point on the map, and each time the evidence slips through their fingers. Some locations fall apart the moment we compare distances. Others only work if we bend Caesar's words until they mean something he clearly did not say. Again and again, we see the same pattern. A theory works only if we assume extra forests, altered roads, missing rivers, or armies behaving in ways that contradict the narrative. At that point, the explanation stops explaining anything. This becomes especially clear when we follow the long debate around places like Hamburg, Limburg, Namur, Montfalais, or Aachen. Each has been defended with care and imagination. Each has been rejected for equally serious reasons. Some are too far from where Caesar places his camps. Some are too strong to make sense of the attacks described. Others are too small to contain the numbers Caesar gives. And many fail for the simplest reason of all. The terrain just does not match the story. We are forced to admit something uncomfortable. The data simply do not allow certainty. Caesar gives us distances, directions, rivers, valleys, slopes, and ambushes. But he does not give us coordinates. He assumes his audience knows the landscape well enough to follow him. We do not. The same problem appears when we turn from Atuatuca itself to the peoples involved. The Atuatuci and the Eburones were not the same people. Caesar makes that clear repeatedly. They had separate territories, separate obligations, and separate political roles. One paid tribute to the other. One marched into the land of the other as an ally, not as part of itself. Their strongholds were different as well. The Atuatuci had fortified hill sites. The Eburones did not. Yet when we try to draw their borders, everything blurs. Rivers may have been boundaries, but they were also highways. Valleys could divide, but they could also unite. The Meuse in particular seems to have been both a frontier and a shared zone, depending on the moment. That alone makes rigid maps misleading. The same uncertainty follows us when we examine Cicero's camp and Labienus's camp. Scholars have scattered them across modern Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern France. Some place Cicero near Charleroi. Others push him to Binche, Namur, Mons, or even farther. But every proposal depends on first fixing Atuatuca. Without that anchor, the entire structure floats. Labienus's camp is slightly less elusive. Caesar tells us more. It lay near a river that could be crossed on foot. It stood close to the frontier between major peoples. Later movements suggest steep riverbanks nearby. One location fits reasonably well. But even here, distance raises doubts. The numbers stretch too far. The marches grow implausibly long. When we turn to the stronghold of the Atuatuci, the problem deepens rather than clears. Caesar describes a place that is naturally fortified, surrounded by steep slopes, with only one narrow approach. It was large enough to shelter tens of thousands of people. The Romans surrounded it with earthworks, towers, and siege engines. It held out for days. Many hills have been proposed. Most fail immediately. Some are too small. Some are too open. Some are nearly encircled by rivers that Caesar never mentions. Others would have forced Roman siege works up and down ground higher than the stronghold itself, which makes no sense at all. Montfalhis comes closest. Experienced observers have argued that its shape fits Caesar's words better than any other. But even here doubts remain. The river nearby is never mentioned. No clear remains confirm occupation. The supposed gentle slope is hard to identify on the ground. In the end, even the best candidate remains uncertain. This is not failure, it is honesty. What we are seeing is the limit of our sources. Caesar was not writing a topographical survey. He was writing a war narrative. He focused on movement, decision, danger, and outcome. He left out what he thought unnecessary. 2,000 years later, those missing details matter far more to us than they ever did to him. The same lesson repeats when we examine smaller peoples, whose names survive only once or twice. Groups like the Branoviches, the Blanovii, or minor Aulerci appear briefly and vanish. We can guess where they lived based on names and later church boundaries, but that is all it is. Educated guessing. Even larger identities like the Belgae refuse to sit still. Caesar sometimes treats them as a single group. At other times, he uses the same word to describe only part of their territory. It is not always clear whether Belgium means all Belgic lands or just a central zone. Manuscripts disagree. Later editors argue. Caesar himself may have slipped, and this matters, because these terms shaped how Romans understood Gaul. They were labels of convenience, not fixed ethnic boxes. The reality on the ground was messier. Alliances shifted. Client peoples existed within larger ones. Some groups were counted as Belgae in one context and as Celtae in another. In the end, we are left with a map full of shaded areas rather than sharp lines. That is not a weakness. It is a reminder of how the ancient world actually worked. Gaul was not a checkerboard of clean borders. It was a living landscape of rivers, hills, forests, roads, and people in motion. Power moved along those lines. Identity followed power. Names survived longer than realities. When we try to locate places like Bibrax, Bratuspantium, or Cenabum on the map of ancient Gaul, we quickly realize how fragile certainty becomes. Each location has been claimed, rejected, and claimed again over centuries of debate. What we are really tracing is not a clear map, but the limits of what our sources allow us to know. Take Bibrax as an example. Napoleon accepted the plateau of Vieux-Laon as its probable site, following earlier scholars who had reached the same conclusion. Just south of this plateau lies the village now called Berrieux, once known as Bébrieux. One theory suggests that an early settlement once stood on the plateau itself was later abandoned in favour of the hill of Laon, and that its people eventually founded a new settlement at Berrieux, giving it the name Bibrax in memory of their lost home. Whatever the truth of that story, one fact stands out. The hill of Laon itself was once known as Bibrax, yet it lies far too distant from the Aisne to match Caesar's description. This makes it far more likely that the name migrated with the people, rather than marking the original site. When we turn to Bratuspantium, uncertainty deepens. Caesar mentions it only once and gives almost no detail. We know it was a stronghold of the Bellovaci and that it surrendered without resistance in 57 BCE as Caesar marched north. That single sentence has generated an astonishing number of theories. Breteuil, Montdidier, Clermont, Beauvais, Montcésar, and several other sites have all been proposed. Each seems plausible at first glance. Each collapses under closer inspection. Some locations sit too close to tribal frontiers to make sense as a principal stronghold. Others are simply too small. Some lack any archaeological evidence of importance. Others require us to imagine towns far larger or more defensible than the landscape allows. Even the most convincing proposals ultimately rely on assumptions rather than proof. In the end, we are forced to accept a simple conclusion. We do not know where Bratuspantium stood, and we probably never will. Marking it on a map without a question mark would be dishonest. The same struggle appears again with Cenabum, perhaps the most fiercely debated site of all. For centuries, tradition placed Cenabum at Orléans. In the modern period, Napoleon revived the claim that it lay instead at Gien or at Gien-le-Vieux. Many later writers followed him without re-examining the evidence. When we return to Caesar's own words, however, the picture becomes much clearer. Caesar tells us that Cenabum belonged to the Carnutes, that Roman traders lived there, that it stood on the right bank of the Loire, and that a bridge directly touched the town. When the Carnutes rebelled, they massacred the traders. Caesar marched rapidly from Scenes, reached Cenabum in a single forced march, set fire to the gates, and trapped the fleeing inhabitants on the bridge and in the narrow streets. Later, he crossed the Loire from that same point and advanced into the territory of the Bituriges. Every one of these details fits Orléans. They do not fit Gien. Archaeology confirms that a Gallic and later Gallo-Roman town called Cenabum existed at Orléans. Coins, inscriptions, road itineraries, and medieval tradition all point to the same conclusion. Attempts to place Caesar's Cenabum elsewhere rely on imagined bridges, misread distances, or forced interpretations of marching speeds. Even the charred remains found at Gien-le-Vieux belong to a fire centuries later than Caesar's campaign. When we strip away local patriotism and inherited assumptions, the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Cenabum stood where Orléans stands today. The evidence is not merely strong, it is overwhelming. Moving beyond individual towns, the same pattern appears when we examine Gallic peoples. Groups like the Cadurci, Cairosi, Condrusi, Paimani, Segni, Caleti, Carnutes, Caturiges, and Coriosolites drift in and out of visibility. Some are named only once. Some survive only through echoes in modern place names. Some were later absorbed into larger political units. Trying to draw sharp borders for them is an illusion. Rivers could divide, but they could also unite. Mountains could isolate, but they could also protect trade routes. Later, church boundaries often cut across earlier tribal lands, confusing the picture even further. In regions like Armorica, later migrations from Britain reshaped dioceses without regard for ancient political realities. What looks like a map is often just a shadow of one. This is especially clear with coastal peoples, like the Coriosolites. We can place them roughly around modern Corsul, bounded by the sea and neighbouring tribes, but their precise limits dissolve the closer we look. Even ancient authors disagreed or omitted them entirely. Later, writers tried to fill the gaps with guesswork, often guided more by names than by evidence. What emerges from all this is not failure, but clarity of a different kind. Ancient Gaul was not a land of neat borders and fixed capitals. It was a landscape in motion. Towns rose and fell. Names migrated. Peoples merged, split, or vanished. Caesar captured one moment in that movement, not a permanent map. Some manuscripts of the late Roman administrative lists preserve the name Coriosolitum, while others give Corisopitum. On the surface, this may look like a small scribal variation, but entire historical reconstructions have been built on it. One influential argument claims that Corisopitum is the correct form, and that this proves the Coriosolites no longer existed as a people by the time the document was written. According to this view, the name points instead to a Breton bishopric, supposedly founded by migrants from Britain. But when we examine this more closely, the foundation crumbles. There is no solid evidence that such a migration created a new city in the 5th century. The name Corisopitum only appears centuries later, while the Breton name of the town throughout the early period was entirely different. The idea that a confused copyist replaced an unfamiliar Gallic name with one he thought he recognised is clever, but it remains speculation. Worse still, there is no trace anywhere else in Gaul of a people called the Corisopites. The simplest explanation is also the strongest. Corisopitum is a scribal error, one of many in these late manuscripts. Once we remove that illusion, the Coriosolites remain exactly where we expect them to be. A distinct people whose territory lay in northern Armorica, long before later migrations reshaped the region. The debate becomes even sharper when we turn to the Diablint. Caesar mentions them only once, as allies of the Veneti during the Great Maritime Revolt. Ptolemy later places them inland, naming a town that most scholars identify with the Roman settlement near modern Jublains. Archaeology supports this identification. The remains of a substantial Gallo-Roman town stand there, and early medieval documents preserve the name of the people in unmistakable form. Yet one modern theory insists that this town was not their capital at all, but merely a colony, and that the true homeland of the Diablinte lay far to the west on the Breton coast. According to this view, the name Aleth, later Saint-Servan, is a distorted survival of Diablint, and the people themselves were a maritime tribe absorbed into Brittany. When we test these claims, they collapse under their own weight. Caesar's list of coastal tribes does not include the Diablints among the true Aromorican peoples. Ptolemy explicitly places them inland. Early medieval texts locate them near the Mayenne, and the supposed linguistic links between Diablint and Aleth are little more than wordplay. We are also warned not to confuse political geography with ecclesiastical geography. The fact that later bishoprics do not line up neatly with Roman administrative units tells us nothing about the original location of Gallic tribes. In Brittany especially, church boundaries were created by incoming populations from Britain, with no regard for older Roman or Gallic divisions. To search for perfect continuity here is to misunderstand how the region was reshaped. By the late 19th century, even scholars who had once supported the coastal theory admitted their mistake. The Diablints belonged inland, near Jublains, and no amount of manuscript juggling can move them elsewhere. A similar fog surrounds the Esuvii. Caesar alone names them, and scribes preserved their name in several distorted forms. Some try to identify them with better-known neighbours, arguing that Caesar must have meant someone else. But coins preserve their name clearly, and manuscript confusion alone explains the variations. We are dealing with a real people, not a scribal invention. Where did they live? The answer is uncertain, but the most reasonable solution places them in what later became the Diocese of Sees. Caesar lists them alongside tribes from neighbouring regions, and later administrative records leave that territory unassigned unless we place the Esuvii there. It is even possible that smaller tribes, later known under different names, were once subdivisions of a larger Esuvian people. Absolute certainty escapes us, but the outline is clear enough. The same pattern repeats with the Garumni, the Gates, and others whose names survive only in passing. Each can be placed approximately, never precisely. The sources do not allow more. This uncertainty reaches its peak with Gorgobina, the stronghold of the boy. Before we can locate the town, we must first decide where the boy themselves settled. Caesar tells us they were allowed to live in Aeduan territory after the Helvetian War, likely as a buffer against rival powers. That alone suggests a western position, closer to the Arverni than to the Bituriges. Many have tried to pin Gorgobina to specific modern towns. Some places are too far south, others too weak defensively, others chosen purely because their names resemble that of the boy. Napoleon favoured one site because it fit a strategic narrative. Others preferred different locations for equally subjective reasons. When all arguments are weighed, none achieves certainty. What we can say is limited but meaningful. The boy most likely settled between the Loire and the Allier. Their stronghold was probably somewhere in that zone. Beyond that, every claim becomes conjecture. And that brings us to the larger lesson. Ancient Gaul was not mapped with the precision we expect today. Names moved, peoples shifted, towns rose, fell, and were renamed. Later writers tried to impose order on a past that resisted it. Several locations have been proposed. One of them is La Guerche-sur-le-Bois, west of Nevers. At first glance, the similarity of names seems tempting. But resemblance alone is a dangerous guide. As critics have long pointed out, the name only looks convincing on the surface. Once we move beyond sound and spelling, the argument quickly collapses. Other scholars shifted their attention further south, arguing that Gorgobina must have stood between the territories of the Aedui and the Bituriges in fertile land, south of the Loire. From this perspective, places like Saint-Paris-le-Châtel begin to look more plausible. The terrain is defensible. The surrounding land could support a garrison, and the site fits reasonably well with Caesar's movements during the campaign. Yet even here, certainty escapes us. The idea that Gorgobina was meant as a forward outpost against the Bituriges is far from proven. We cannot simply assume that the Aedui were thinking in terms of fixed frontier defences as later Roman administrators would. Political geography in late Iron Age Gaul was far more fluid. What becomes clear is this. No matter how confidently some maps label the territory of the boy or place Gorgobina at a specific point, the evidence does not justify that confidence. The sources are fragmentary. Caesar gives us movement, not coordinates. Archaeology offers possibilities, not conclusions. When we talk about political power in Caesar's Gaul, we must first abandon a modern expectation. This was not a world of clear constitutions, fixed offices, or stable legal categories. Authority shifted constantly, shaped by tradition, fear, ambition, and the balance of force. Some historians once argued that kings in Gaul ruled only with the consent of the majority, and that their power was sharply limited. They often pointed to Caesar's account of Ambiorix, who openly admits that his authority over his people was no greater than their authority over him. From this, it was concluded that kingship in Gaul was not an ancient institution, but a temporary and unstable creation, born out of crisis and factional conflict. When we examine the evidence as a whole, however, a more complex picture emerges. Caesar names several kings across Gaul, from the Sequani and the Arverni to the Atrebates and the Eburones. Some ruled long before Caesar arrived. Others were installed by Roman power. Some were overthrown or murdered by their own people. And several men who tried to seize royal authority were executed for doing so. What this tells us is not that monarchy was unknown, but that it had become controversial. In many Gallic societies, kingship had once existed, but had later been overthrown. Attempts to revive it were often met with violent resistance. Among some peoples, especially in Belgic regions, kingship survived more easily. Elsewhere, power was deliberately fragmented. In place of kings, many Gallic states relied on annually elected magistrates and powerful councils. Among the Aedui, the highest official was the vergobre, a figure who held authority over life and death within the community. Yet even this office was tightly constrained. Caesar describes moments when rival candidates claimed the title at the same time, plunging the state into crisis. These disputes show how fragile political legitimacy could be, and how easily institutions could be paralyzed by factional struggle. The question of whether more than one vergobre could rule at the same time has long been debated. Coins, inscriptions, and ambiguous phrasing in Caesar's text have been used to argue both sides, but when we step back, the larger point becomes clear. Power in Gaul was rarely clean or stable. Offices existed, but they were constantly contested. Authority depended less on law alone and more on alliances, reputation, and armed support. This leads us to the deeper structure of Gallic society. Some scholars once argued that Gaul was organized entirely around clans, and that what Caesar called states were little more than loose collections of family groups. According to this view, each clan ruled its own territory, and the state itself barely existed. Yet the sources do not fully support this. Caesar never describes Gaul as a society of clans in the strict sense. He speaks instead of communities, districts, councils, and magistrates. Local units certainly mattered, and smaller communities could sometimes act independently. But it was the larger political body that negotiated with Rome, raised armies, and made war. Senates played a real role. Caesar describes them as large bodies, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, and sometimes reduced almost to nothing by war. These were not informal gatherings. They were institutions with authority, even if we cannot reconstruct their exact composition. They likely included leading landowners, local chiefs, and officials drawn from across the territory. Law, too, functioned differently from what we might expect. Written codes were rare or non-existent. Custom ruled daily life. Disputes were settled according to tradition, memory, and precedent. The Druids acted as judges and arbiters, especially in matters of inheritance and boundaries. This was not chaos. It was a system rooted in social authority rather than written statutes. One of the most debated questions concerns land itself. Did the Gauls recognize private ownership of land, or was all land held collectively by the community? Some argued that private property did not exist, that land belonged to the state and was merely assigned for use. But when we examine Caesar carefully, this claim becomes impossible to maintain. He explicitly contrasts the Gauls with the Germans, noting that the Germans rejected private land ownership to prevent inequality and unrest. The implication is clear. Gaul did not follow this rule. Inheritance disputes make little sense without private property. Boundaries are meaningless unless land belongs to someone. The existence of wealthy elites, coinage, trade, slavery, and debt all point toward a society where land was owned, inherited, and controlled by individuals and families. The poor were often forced into dependence because they had no land of their own. This brings us to the social hierarchy. Caesar tells us that in Gaul there were only two groups that truly mattered, the Druids and the warriors. The rest of the population lived in near servitude. Within the warrior class, some men were more powerful than others. These were the nobles. But nobility was not a separate caste. It was simply the upper layer of the warrior elite. A man could rise. Ability, wealth, and influence mattered. Horses, followers, and armed retainers were signs of power, not birth alone. Some nobles commanded large personal forces. Others depended on alliances and reputation. This system rested heavily on dependency. Powerful men surrounded themselves with followers of different ranks. Some were companions bound by loyalty and honor. Others were debtors, driven into dependence by poverty or oppression. Some were little better than slaves. The language used to describe these relationships is confusing, even in ancient sources. What matters is the structure. Power flowed downward through personal bonds, not upward through institutions. This concentration of power in noble families has sometimes been exaggerated. There is no evidence that aristocrats across Gaul formed a single united class acting against kings or states. Rivalries were constant. Ambition often turned inward, not outward. Unity, when it came, was fragile and temporary. The great revolts against Rome did not arise from a stable noble conspiracy, but from desperate attempts to hold together societies already divided by fear, inequality, and internal conflict. For a long time, some writers denied that slavery existed in Gaul, but the evidence says otherwise. Caesar himself, in several separate passages, makes it clear that unfree labour was part of Gallic society. Slavery may not have looked exactly like the Roman system, but dependence, coercion, and loss of freedom were very real. Power in Gaul did not flow from written constitutions or fixed borders. Instead, it moved through relationships between tribes. These relationships took different forms. Some tribes were linked by simple alliances, others lived under protection, and some were openly dependent on stronger neighbours. These ties were flexible and often ambiguous. A tribe could be protected without being ruled, loyal without being subordinate, or dependent without losing all internal freedom. When Caesar speaks of tribes being in the faith of another, he is describing more than friendship. This was protection, backed by power. A weaker people placed itself under the shield of a stronger one, expecting support in war and diplomacy. In return, the stronger tribe gained influence, prestige, and often military service. But this did not always mean direct control. Many dependent tribes managed their own internal affairs and could even shift allegiance when circumstances changed. This explains why rebellion did not always follow neat lines. Some tribes remained loyal while others rose in revolt, even when bound by old ties. Dependency in Gaul was not a rigid system. It was a web of obligations, pressure, and opportunity, constantly renegotiated. At the center of this web stood powerful tribal leaders. Their authority rested not only on lineage or office, but on personal followings. Clients, debtors, retainers, and armed companions formed the backbone of political power. Loyalty was personal before it was institutional. A man followed a leader, not an abstract state. This brings us to one of the most debated questions of all. Was Gallic society moving toward democracy in Caesar's time? Some historians have argued that a popular movement was already undermining aristocratic rule, and that the great uprising led by Vercingetorix was as much a social revolution as a national one. At first glance, this idea is tempting. Caesar often mentions crowds, popular enthusiasm, and leaders who enjoyed immense support among the masses. But when we look closely, the picture changes. Caesar is very explicit about the structure of Gallic society. He tells us that there were only two groups that truly mattered: the nobles and the druids. The mass of the population, the common people, had no formal political role. They were excluded from councils and decision-making. Many were bound to nobles by debt or dependence, living lives not far removed from servitude. This does not mean the people were invisible. Popular opinion mattered. Leaders ignored it at their peril. Ambitious men courted the crowd with generosity, promises, and spectacle. But influence is not the same as power. Being listened to is not the same as ruling. Again and again, when we examine the major events of the Gallic War, we see the same pattern. Decisions are made by chiefs, councils, and leading men. Wars begin because nobles decide they must begin. Alliances are forged by elite negotiation. Even mass rebellions are planned, coordinated, and led by aristocrats. Vercingetorix himself fits this pattern perfectly. He was not a spokesman of the poor rising against their masters. He was a noble of the highest rank, commanding loyalty through lineage, charisma, and force. When he first attempted to launch his revolt, he was opposed by other nobles, not by institutions of popular rule. He was expelled from his city by aristocrats, gathered followers among the discontented and dependent, and then returned with enough strength to seize power. When he was proclaimed leader of the Gallic resistance, this was not the result of a democratic election in the modern sense. It was recognition by councils of chiefs, ratified by military support and popular enthusiasm. Acclamation is not the same as constitutional authority. Throughout the war, the same reality holds. Councils of leaders debate strategy, chiefs raise armies, officers command, the masses follow. Even when crowds act violently or impulsively, they do so under the influence of leading men. The people are instruments, not authors, of political change. This is not to say that Gallic society was static. Pressure was building. War loosened old bonds. Men who had no voice in peace found themselves armed in wartime. Loyalty shifted. Authority became more fragile. In moments of crisis, crowds could sway outcomes, intimidate councils, and force decisions. But this is not democracy. It is instability. As for the Druids, their role has often been exaggerated or misunderstood. They were powerful as judges, teachers, and guardians of tradition. They could exclude individuals from society and impose religious sanctions that carried real consequences. But there is no clear evidence that they acted as a unified political force during the Great Rebellion. Individual druids may have taken sides, but there is no sign of a coordinated priestly intervention shaping the war. Caesar's silence on their political role is telling. He was not hiding their actions, he was focused on what affected his campaigns. If the Druids had decisively altered events, he would have said so. Their influence was real, but it was not decisive. In the end, what we see in Caesar's Gaul is not a democracy struggling to be born, but a hierarchical society under immense strain. Power rested with nobles and religious elites. The people mattered, but they did not rule. The rebellion of Vercingetorix was a national uprising, not a social revolution. If anything, it revealed the limits of aristocratic control rather than its collapse. Leaders needed the masses more than ever, but they still commanded them. And when the war was lost, it was the nobles who negotiated, surrendered, or were destroyed. This is the world Caesar conquered. Not a land of free citizens rising as one, but a complex society bound by loyalty, fear, belief, and ambition. A society whose fractures were exposed by war, but not yet transformed. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. One ancient tradition connects the first Celtic entry into Italy with the founding of Massilia on the Mediterranean coast. That would push the invasion back to the early 6th century before Christ. Yet many historians have rejected this idea. They argue that this neat connection belongs not to early memory, but to later attempts to force events into tidy timelines. What seems more likely is that small groups of Celts began crossing the Alps long before the great invasions that terrified Italy. These early arrivals may have settled quietly in the lands between the Alps and the Po, living alongside or under the shadow of Etruscan power. Only later, when Etruscan control weakened, did larger waves pour into the plain and permanently transform the region. By the end of the 5th century before Christ, the balance of power had clearly shifted. The Etruscans were losing their grip, and the Celts were no longer newcomers. Ancient writers describe the fall of Etruscan strongholds and the sudden appearance of Gallic armies in central Italy, culminating in the march on Rome itself. From their perspective, this felt like a sudden catastrophe. In reality, it was the final act of a much longer story. This helps explain why some sources speak of multiple invasions rather than one. We are probably not dealing with a single migration, but with successive movements over generations. Some tribes arrived earlier, others later. Some settled, others pushed onward. The names change, the routes overlap, and the memories blur. Where did these invaders come from? Here again, certainty escapes us. Some scholars have argued that the Celts, who entered Italy, came not from Gaul, west of the Alps, but from regions further north and east, beyond the mountains. Others maintain that Transalpine Gaul itself was the source. When we examine the evidence carefully, neither position can completely exclude the other. Ancient writers knew that Celts lived on both sides of the Alps. They also knew that populations moved constantly. There is nothing implausible in the idea that tribes from Gaul proper joined forces with groups from the Danube or Alpine valleys. Migration rarely follows a single path. What matters more than exact origins is the result. By the early 4th century before Christ, Celtic power dominated northern Italy. Their presence reshaped the political map and left a lasting impression on Roman memory. This same uncertainty surrounds the famous wanderers of the late 2nd century, before Christ, the Cimbri and the Teutoni. Their sudden appearance shook the Roman world, and their origins have been debated ever since. Most ancient writers believed that the Cimbri came from the far north, from lands near the ocean. Many later identified their homeland with the peninsula we now call Jutland. Roman fleets even sailed toward those distant coasts, and embassies arrived in Rome claiming descent from the same people who had once crushed Roman armies. Some modern scholars have challenged this tradition, suggesting instead that the Cimbri originated further south, in central Germany. They point to archaeological patterns and ancient confusion between Celts and Germans. But archaeology can mislead, and ancient geography was often vague. What the ancients consistently believed was that the Cimbri came from the northern edge of the known world, driven south by disaster, whether flood or upheaval. As for their identity, the debate is even more tangled. Some sources call them Celts, others Germans. Their leaders bear Celtic names. Their enemies describe them as German. Their customs resemble both worlds. In truth, we are likely dealing with a mixed people, shaped by centuries of contact and migration. In antiquity, ethnic boundaries were not fixed lines. They were zones of blending. The Teutoni, who fought alongside the Cimbri, were almost certainly Germanic. Whether they joined the Cimbri from the beginning or later remains unclear. Ancient summaries often mention only the Cimbri, using the name as a shorthand for the entire host. We see the same habit in other ancient narratives, where one name stands for many peoples. What we can say with confidence is this: the Roman Republic faced not a single tribe, but a moving world of peoples, united, temporarily, by desperation and opportunity. This brings us back to Caesar and his own German adversary, Ariovistus. When did Ariovistus arrive in Gaul? Caesar reports that Ariovistus claimed his people had lived without permanent homes for 14 years. Some have taken this to mean that he crossed into Gaul around 70 before Christ. Others suggest that his wandering began earlier, east of the Rhine. What seems clear is that Ariovistus did not drift into Gaul by accident. He came for reward, power, and land. He did not abandon his homeland without strong incentives. By the time Caesar confronted him, his position in Gaul was already well established. This is confirmed by the battle that sealed his dominance, the Battle of Magetobriga. The evidence suggests that this decisive clash occurred around 60 before Christ. It was not a simple victory over one tribe. Ariovistus faced a coalition of Gallic forces who had once invited him as an ally and now desperately sought to remove him. They failed. The consequences were severe. Hostages were taken, territory was seized. German settlers crossed the Rhine in growing numbers. For many Gauls, the Roman intervention that followed seemed less like conquest and more like rescue. Other questions linger around this period. Where exactly Roman commanders fell in earlier Gallic Wars? Whether ambitious leaders like Dumnorix truly held official power or merely dominated through influence? Even the year of Caesar's own birth remains disputed. What emerges from all this is not confusion for its own sake, but a deeper truth. The late Republic operated in a world of uncertainty. Borders were fluid, peoples moved, alliances shifted, Roman generals reacted as much as they planned. When Caesar set out for Gaul, he may not have intended to conquer it outright. But once events began to unfold, ambition, fear, and opportunity pushed him forward. Each crisis demanded a solution. Each solution created a new frontier, and each frontier demanded defense. Some researchers mocked the entire debate, asking whether a normal legion strength ever truly existed. Their point was not that the Romans lacked official numbers, but that real legions were constantly changing. Men died, fell sick, deserted, or were replaced. A legion that was full one year might be half empty the next. In that sense, there was no fixed fighting strength that applied at all times. But this does not mean the Romans had no standard at all. Like modern armies, they worked with an ideal number, a theoretical full strength. The real question is whether that standard changed between the time of Marius and the time of Caesar. Many clues suggest that the traditional figure of around 6,000 men per legion still existed on paper. Armies, modelled on the Roman system, used this number. Some commanders fielded legions that seemed to approach it. Yet when we look at Caesar's campaigns more closely, we repeatedly find legions operating far below that figure. At key moments in the Gallic War, entire legions numbered only a few thousand men. Later, during the Civil War, the average strength dropped even further. In one major battle, Caesar's legions averaged fewer than 3,000 men each. These were not weak units, but hardened veterans who had been fighting for years. What this tells us is crucial. The Roman legion was not a fixed block of identical size. Its real strength depended on how long it had been campaigning, how severe its losses were, and whether replacements had arrived. Trying to calculate legion strength by abstract formulas or transport capacity leads nowhere. The only reliable method is to examine each campaign individually. Now, let us turn from numbers to command. The Roman army under Caesar was not as rigidly structured as later imperial armies. Officers often shifted roles and authority was more fluid than many textbooks suggest. Senators appointed as senior officers served as Caesar's deputies. One day, they might command a legion in battle. The next, they might be raising troops or managing supplies. These officers were not permanent legion commanders in the later imperial sense. They held command only as long as Caesar wished. He reassigned them freely, sometimes giving one man authority over several legions at once. This flexibility gave Caesar enormous control and allowed him to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Beneath them stood the military tribunes. They are often portrayed as politically appointed amateurs, pushed aside by professionals. There is some truth in this image, but it is far too simple. While Caesar did reward political allies with tribuneships, he also relied heavily on competent tribunes in combat. Tribunes attended councils of war, commanded detachments, led ships in naval battles, and coordinated troop movements during major engagements. In several battles, Caesar addresses his orders directly to tribunes, not centurions. This shows that they played a real operational role, even if their status had declined compared to earlier centuries. The true backbone of the army, however, was the centurionate. Among the centurions, a small group stood above the rest, the centurions of the first rank. These men were not simply respected veterans. They formed a clearly recognized elite within the legion. They were summoned to war councils, singled out in official reports, and promoted through a defined hierarchy. The evidence makes it clear that this was not a vague, honorific category. It was a formal class. Promotion into it marked the culmination of a centurion's career. One famous case describes a man rising from a lower rank straight to the highest centurionate after exceptional bravery. Such promotions only make sense if the ranks themselves were clearly structured. Many modern theories have tried to reconstruct this hierarchy, some proposing 2 classes, others 6, 7, or even more. Most collapse under scrutiny. They either ignore clear textual evidence or rely on strained interpretations. The simplest and strongest conclusion is this: centurions were ranked primarily by cohort. Each cohort formed a step in the ladder. The first cohort stood above all others, and its centurions collectively formed the highest rank within the legion. This system fits the ancient evidence, explains promotion patterns, and avoids unnecessary complexity. This hierarchy mattered. These men led from the front, steadied wavering lines, and held together units under extreme pressure. When disaster struck, they were often the first to fall. Finally, we return to a logistical question that shaped Caesar's greatest expeditions. From which port did he sail to Britain? For a long time, scholars argued over two candidates. Both could technically fit the ancient descriptions. But when we consider the practical realities of naval movement, tides, beaching hundreds of ships, and sheltering them for weeks, the balance shifts decisively. Only one port meets all the requirements described in Caesar's own account. It offered enough space, manageable tides, and access routes suitable for repeated large-scale embarkations. The alternative would have demanded conditions that simply did not exist at the time. What matters here is not just identifying a place on a map. It is understanding how Roman military planning worked in practice. Caesar chose routes and harbours based on experience, not theory. Once he found a superior solution, he used it again. When we try to understand how power worked in Gaul on the eve of the Roman conquest, we quickly realise that there was no single political force pulling everything together. Some historians have claimed that the leading families of different tribes were so tightly connected through marriage and agreements that they formed an informal league, strong enough to block both kings and local states from uniting Gaul. According to this view, no single authority could ever succeed because the aristocracy itself prevented it. But when we look closely at the actual events described by our sources, this interpretation begins to weaken. Before the Great Helvethian Migration, we see an ambitious noble, Vercingetorix, attempting to form an alliance with two other powerful figures from neighbouring peoples. This was not a conspiracy against kingship or against any political system. It was a personal power move. And it was stopped not by some pan-Gallic aristocratic league, but by the Helvetii themselves, acting as a single community. The same pattern appears elsewhere. The father of Vercingetorix was executed for trying to make royal power hereditary within his own family. But he was not destroyed by foreign nobles or rival tribes. He was eliminated by the leaders of his own people, who feared tyranny more than fragmentation. What doomed him was not unity among aristocrats across Gaul, but resistance inside his own political community. Of course, nobles from different tribes later cooperated against Caesar. But cooperation in war is not the same as a permanent alliance aimed at suppressing unity. If such a league had truly existed, it is difficult to explain the constant infighting, rivalry, and civil conflict that plagued Gaul throughout the war. Even figures like Dumnorix, who built marriage ties and alliances beyond his own people, did so to strengthen his personal position, not to uphold some shared aristocratic ideology. And when we ask whether any king or state, apart from a few exceptional cases, seriously attempted to unite Gaul before Caesar, the answer is largely no. With rare exceptions, no one even tried. There was, however, a deeper obstacle to unity: the fear of tyranny. Many Gallic peoples had dismantled kingship in the past, and they placed strict limits on their magistrates. Any attempt at centralization triggered suspicion. This climate alone would have made long-term unification extremely difficult. But this resistance did not operate through a coordinated, aristocratic conspiracy across tribes. It operated locally, through internal checks and violent reactions to perceived overreach. To understand Gallic society better, we need to look at the social bonds that held it together. Caesar tells us that elite warriors surrounded themselves with groups of dependents. These included personal attendants, followers, and clients. Not all of these people were equal. Some were closer to servants, others closer to free retainers. Ancient writers use different words for these groups, and the distinctions matter. Some dependents were tied to their leaders through debt. Burdened by obligations, they placed themselves under the protection of powerful men and lost much of their freedom in the process. Others followed their leaders voluntarily, hoping for protection, status, or reward. These free retainers were not slaves, but their independence was limited by loyalty and obligation. What matters is that Gallic power was built less on formal institutions than on personal networks. Influence flowed through followers, debtors, and armed companions. A noble's strength depended on how many people he could mobilize and how loyal they were. Slavery also existed in Gaul. Despite occasional attempts to deny it, the sources are clear. Slaves were used, traded, and even sacrificed in funerary rituals. Gallic society was hierarchical, unequal, and deeply stratified. Relations between tribes followed similar patterns of flexibility and imbalance. Some peoples were allies, others lived under protection. Still, others were clearly subordinate. These relationships were not fixed categories. A people might be protected by a stronger neighbour while retaining internal autonomy. Another might provide troops or tribute. Clientship could range from loose friendship to near domination. The Aedui and the Remi exercised influence over many neighbouring peoples, but their authority was never absolute. Client tribes could rebel, switch allegiance, or act independently when opportunity arose. Overlordship was negotiated, contested, and constantly at risk. In rare cases, relationships went further. Some peoples shared laws, institutions, and even rulers. These deep ties suggest that in certain regions, political integration had advanced further than elsewhere. But these cases were exceptional. When Rome entered this world, it stepped into a landscape already divided, competitive, and unstable. This brings us to the question of loyalty to Rome. Some have argued that Caesar relied on a republican party within Gaul, opposing ambitious would-be kings. Others claim he abandoned conservative elites and turned instead to popular movements. But when we examine the record, neither theory holds up cleanly. Caesar supported whoever supported him. He rewarded loyalty with power, restored families to prominence, and installed kings when it suited his interests. Some of these kings were assassinated by their own people. Others were overthrown by councils. In each case, resistance came from inside the community, not from some unified nationalist movement. There is no solid evidence for a coherent pro-Roman or anti-Roman party stretching across Gaul. Reactions to Rome varied by place, moment, and circumstance. Some opposed Caesar from the start. Others resisted only when victory seemed possible. Many cooperated until cooperation no longer served them. By the final years of the war, nearly all of Gaul rose in revolt. Old friendships no longer mattered. Former allies turned hostile. The desire to recover independence and honour outweighed past favours and calculations. In a few cases, internal divisions remained. Some leaders resisted rebellion, others led it. But by then, Caesar faced not factions, but a collective will hardened by years of war. In the end, we must be honest about our limits. It is easy to construct elegant theories about grand strategies, hidden alliances, and ideological parties. But the evidence does not support such certainty. What we see instead is a fragmented political world, driven by fear of tyranny, personal ambition, local rivalries, and shifting loyalties. Caesar did not conquer a unified enemy, he conquered a divided one, and that division, more than Roman genius alone, explains his success. When we ask where Druidism began, we step into a fog of tradition, guesses, and modern theories that are often far more confident than the evidence allows. Our main ancient witness tells us that many people believed the Druid teachings were first discovered in Britain and later brought across the Channel into Gaul. Some scholars have taken that line as literal history. Others treat it as rumour, or as a way of saying that Britain was the place where Druid training was strongest. But here is the problem. The deeper we dig, the more we realise we cannot travel much further back than that single report. Early writers mention Druids only briefly and always from the outside. We do not get a clear founding moment, a clear homeland, or a clear timeline. All we can say with confidence is that by the late Republic, Druids were a recognised institution, and the belief in a British origin was already circulating. Some have tried to argue that Druidism could not have started in Gaul because the Gallic invaders of Italy seem to show no trace of it. Yet even that argument rests largely on silence. Ancient historians do not always record priests, and when they do, they often focus only on what is useful for their story. Other scholars have answered that even if those warbands had no Druids with them, it does not prove Druids did not exist back home. A religious specialist class could have been present in earlier centuries in a simpler form, less visible to foreign observers, and only later grew into the powerful order described in Gaul. Then there is the older, more dramatic idea that Druidism is prehistoric, tied to the world of stone monuments and ancient ritual landscapes. Some writers have claimed that massive megaliths must imply a religious elite, strong enough to organise labour on a huge scale. But even if we accept that ancient monuments point to social control, we still cannot jump straight from that to Druids. Monument building exists in many cultures. If we use stones as proof of Druids, we end up making Druidism almost universal, which explains everything and proves nothing. Another approach claims Druidism appeared late, as a specialised profession that separated from kingship. The argument goes like this. Early Celtic societies may have had rulers who handled both leadership and sacred duties, and only later did those religious roles split off into a distinct priestly class. That sounds neat, but it runs into an awkward question. If Druidism truly flourished in the remote parts of Britain long before the Roman conquest, are we really supposed to imagine that those distant communities were advanced enough to produce an organised religious elite, while comparable peoples across the sea had nothing similar? We can twist the theory to fit, but the more we twist, the less believable it becomes. And there is one point that matters more than any clever model. Druidism was an unwritten teaching. It lived in memory and training, not in books. That makes the idea of it being imported, without Druids themselves carrying it, extremely hard to accept. If the doctrine crossed the sea, the teachers likely crossed with it. So where does this leave us? With humility. We can build hypotheses forever, but unless new evidence appears, the safest position is still the simplest one. We cannot get behind that old report that Britain was seen as the birthplace of the Druid teaching. Now we move from origins to power, and here another debate appears. Some writers have tried to downplay the Druids, arguing that their authority was exaggerated. They point to the Great Gallic Rebellion and ask why we do not see Druids leading it openly. They wonder why the record does not show a priesthood acting like a national command centre. But we have to remember how our sources work. The narrative is built around military operations. It often ignores anything that does not visibly change the campaign. That does not mean Druids were absent. It means the author chose not to spotlight them unless they affected his decisions. We can still say a few things. It is difficult to believe Druids as individuals stood aside while their societies burned. Some would have favoured resistance, others cooperation, just like nobles did. But the idea of a unified Druid organisation speaking with one voice across dozens of rival peoples is unlikely. Gaul was not a single nation. It was a competitive mosaic. If two major tribes went to war, Druids from one side would naturally be opposed to Druids from the other. A permanent, unanimous, national priesthood does not fit that world. What we can say is that the Druids held a form of authority that did not rely on armies. their strongest weapon was exclusion. If someone defied them, that person could be cut off from public life. In practice, that meant people avoided them, shunned them, and refused them legal protection. Even without soldiers, that kind of pressure can enforce decisions with brutal efficiency. At the same time, we should not imagine the Druids as judges for every dispute in society. It is more likely that powerful households handled many conflicts internally, especially when nobles held overwhelming control over dependents and clients. Yet when a decision carried moral weight, social consequences, or intergroup tension, the Druid verdict could carry enormous force precisely because it looked sacred and final. This brings us to another popular claim, that the Druids and the noble class formed a united front against the common people, as if there were a rising democratic movement they needed to crush. It is a dramatic story, but the evidence is thin. We can guess that the Druids and elite families often shared interests, because many Druids likely came from influential backgrounds, and because elite families sent their sons into Druid education. But turning that into a proven political alliance against democracy goes far beyond what the sources show. And this matters, because some modern narratives insist that the rebellion of Vercingetorix was not only a national uprising against Rome, but also a social revolution that lifted the people against an oligarchy. We hear claims that a democratic wave was already rising when Caesar arrived, and that during the war the old order began to crack. So we test it. We do not start with big slogans, we start with the episodes. We begin with the Helvetii. Their migration plan is presented as elite-driven. One extremely rich noble builds a conspiracy among high-status men, pushes the community toward migration, and tries to secure personal dominance through alliances. When the plot is discovered, it is not the masses seizing power. It is the state machinery reacting through its officials. Magistrates call up manpower from the countryside, and force is used to enforce the law. Whatever else this is, it is not a democratic revolution. Next, we look at Aeduan politics. We hear that certain individuals had great influence over the masses. We hear that one leader was popular because he was generous. We hear that public opinion mattered. But none of this proves democratic institutions. In any society, even a harsh aristocracy must consider popular mood. Leaders manipulate crowds, crowds can pressure leaders, and reputation can bend decisions. That is human politics, not proof of constitutional change. Then, we reach a darker scene. In at least one region, a senate is killed because it opposed war. It is tempting to picture a spontaneous popular explosion. But even here we cannot be sure. The Senate may not have included all elites, and rival elite factions may have driven the violence. The killers themselves could not have been the people in the abstract. Real violence is organized by real groups, usually under influential direction. Even if we assume popular fury played a role, one massacre does not equal a democratic transformation. Another example shows a war leader unable to restrain his own force. His followers refuse to let him leave until he agrees to act. That reveals discipline problems. It shows a crowd pushing commanders. But armies have always done this, even in rigid monarchies. Mutiny is not democracy. Finally, we reach the famous line attributed to Ambiorix, where he claims the multitude has rights over him as much as he has power over them. Some have treated this as proof that the people were gaining political rights. But we have to be careful. That statement reaches us through layers of reporting, and it was spoken in a context of deception. Even if it was true, it tells us almost nothing about Gaul as a whole. At best, it suggests that one community may have had an unusually strong, popular element in its political life. One case among dozens is not a continent-wide revolution. So what do we conclude? the grand claim that Gaul was moving toward democracy before Caesar, or that a democratic revolution was underway during his early years, collapses under scrutiny. The evidence does not support it. What we see instead is a political world dominated by elites, shaped by personal followings, debt dependence, rival factions, and occasional explosions of violence. Popular pressure existed, but it does not equal popular power. And that final point matters, because it changes how we read the Great Rebellion. The war for independence was real. The desire for freedom and honor was real. But building a modern democratic origin story on top of it is far more imagination than history.